Now that we've learned how Paine came to be excluded from the canon, we are now going to focus on Paine's ideas and rhetoric as they first emerged in the late 18th century. Why did Paine worry the elite so much? And in turn, how did others throughout the century seek to co-opt Paine? This is kind of a continuation of what we spoke of earlier about his legacy. And anyway, Jay Ward comes to us from the New York Council of Humanities, and I'll have to say that they made an excellent choice in getting him because he's one of the liveliest speakers I've ever heard.
Thank you. It's the shortest introduction I've ever had. I guess lively isn't bad, better than moribund. I'm going to take a couple of things for granted today, so you'll excuse me if I don't go into excruciating biographical detail about Thomas Paine. I will assume that the majority, if not all of you, have read Thomas Paine to one extent or another beyond quotes that appear on plaques and buildings and various T-shirts at odd sort of gatherings of people with big funny hats. I'm going to assume that you yourselves are involved in politics in some way or another, usually from a progressive scale, even if that's a right progressive sort of libertarianism, which we can get to at some point. I will assume that you're here because you take a vested interest in Thomas Paine's legacy, in the importance of his ideas to the founding of the American state, as well as to the importance of his ideas for our nation now. And what, if anything, can a guy who died in 1809 say to us in 2010, since so much else of the world has changed so much and so rapidly? In many ways, things that were said even in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and perhaps even last week may not be apropos. If you take John Kenneth Galbraith's idea from the Affluent Society, and he talks about the conventional wisdom, you know that, in fact, by the time an idea has gained currency, it's already outmoded, it's already outdated. The beautiful thing about Paine is that he is constantly and consistently and perhaps permanently ahead of the curve. This is what makes him a radical. This is what keeps him radical. And this is what will always likely put him in a position different from virtually every other thinker that we may come across, with some grave and pretty monumental exceptions. And not to put too much glory in his hat and his cup, but someone like Socrates, for example, or Plato, whose questions and ideas about society are appropriate contemporarily, and they're appropriately in a timeless fashion as well. So today I'd like to talk about really two things about Thomas Paine. Part of his idea of his legacy, which I said I won't go into a lot of detail about his biography per se, but I would like to try and look at him and his ideas in a larger structural sense in relationship to his time, the ideas of liberalism, the ideas of politics at the end of the 18th century, what it meant to be a liberal in Britain or America at the end of the 18th century. A liberal, perhaps someone like, John Adams, who there was that wonderful, interesting, I say wonderful as in nice to see something about the revolution, less wonderful in that I wonder what's agitprop and what's history and what's good sales for TV. But I'd like to read for you a quote about Paine by Adams, which is often excerpted. And I will read you the excerpted piece first, and then I'll read you the whole quote. And then this will go somewhere towards explaining just about everything in my talk, including the appropriation of Paine and what it is to be a liberal. So it says here, this is 1805, John Adams writing to someone. I know not whether any man in the world has had more influence on its inhabitants or affairs in the last 30 years than Tom Paine. Wow. I read the whole quote. I am willing you should call this the age of frivolity, as you do, and I would not object if you had named it the age of folly, vice, frenzy, brutality, Damon's, Bonaparte, Tom Paine, or the age of the burning brand from the bottomless pit, or anything but the age of reason. I know not whether any man in the world has had any more influence on its inhabitants or its affairs in the last 30 years than Tom Paine. There can be no severer satyr of the age, for such a mongrel between pig and puppy, begotten on a wild boar on a bitch wolf, never before in the age of the world was suffered the poltroonery of mankind to run through such a career of mischief. Call it then the age of Paine. The great John Adams. Well, Thomas Paine is a fascinating figure. Thomas Paine manages to incite the passions from whatever side of the spectrum, even if you're smack in the middle of someone like Barack Obama. That you can quote him, and you can excerpt him, and you can make a great message and a great slogan. But the problem is that often when Paine is quoted, it's these vaguely inspirational, agit-pop, slogan-type things that are really great and really catchy and quite, sum up a moment. But they're not necessarily expressions of political ideas or ideology. Now, this is not in any way to lessen the quote, or lessen the moment, or lessen the impact at the time. But it's very easy in this way for his political history, the idea of who he is. Oh, he's a great founding father, and we'll talk about the problems with bad history, because with bad history, you can make anything like anything. If you remember, Reagan once said the Sandinistas, who were the bad guys, were being fought by the Contras, who, as he said, were just like our founding fathers. So right-wing paramilitaries funded by secret drugs and arms trade, just like the founding fathers. But the quoting of Paine often is used as a way to appropriate a historical vision of the past to brand oneself. Branding an idea or a concept, a flavor of politics, by donning some idea of what an 18th century outfit might look like, putting thee and thou in a couple of your words, and all of a sudden you are smack in the middle of the cauldron of the American Revolution, fighting for these great ideals. Well, the tragedy is, from the right wing, when I see the appropriation of Paine, I see these people not in any ways associated, even with someone as vaguely radical, and I'll talk about vaguely in a sense, as John Adams, but in fact more Tories at the end of the 18th century. I mean, I'm not even sure they could muster the liberalism of Burke, who even supported the American Revolution, didn't support the French Revolution, which of course led to a lot of conflict between Burke and Paine, who were in fact friends until that moment. And in the Age of Reason, and in Rights of Man, Paine expounds an idea about religion and politics that is a significant break from even the vaguely liberal tradition of the Whigs in Britain, who saw themselves rise to power for a brief period at the end of the 18th century, but then throughout that period of time, both in America and in Britain, the gagging laws in Britain and the Alien Sedition Acts in the United States were born specifically out of a fear of an increasing radicalism that goes beyond the sort of genteel democratic politics of 18th century representative democracy, in which even in the French Constitution, which Paine objected to, property rights were still necessary for voting qualifications. And so it's like I said with Galbraith earlier, all the economic policy of the last 200 years takes for granted the concept of a free market, without questioning the reality of what free markets may do. Paine says the same thing about politics. If you grant any other qualification than being alive, and I guess sentient, for political involvement, for political rights, you are going to create a system which is going to be exclusionary, and anything that is exclusionary is going to create inequality, and in any stage where there's inequality, it must necessitate oppression and exploitation and obfuscation and mystery and honor and tradition, where honor and tradition is not due. Think of what he says in Common Sense about the English monarchy. He asks you to look into the origins of the monarchy, in the same way that he asks you to look into the origins of the Bible, of Christianity, of Mohammedanism, of Judaism, all the Abrahamic religions. And he says, if you look honestly, and this is actually, I think, what makes a radical. A radical is a person who's willing to speak the truth at any time when others are really scared of what that truth may do. And in an age where it is so easy to propagate ideas, even in the 18th century, a comparatively primitive age for our day, you have the beginnings of the bourgeois public sphere and printing and newspapers and nascent magazines. And so you're creating the idea where ideas can be propagated in a way never before. But we're now at the end of an interesting arc of the creation and propagation of ideas via technology, of which Paine himself was a perfect example of through the pamphlet. And his ideas get spouted and replicated and create live in a universe on their own, which becomes detached from that initial historical reality which Paine has to be situated and therefore seen inherently as a radical. But in both the Age of Reason and in Common Sense, he asks you to look at the thing as it is. Strip away the pomp and circumstance, the lovely phrases, the gold braiding from the British monarchy. And as he said, you more often get an ass than a lion. He says, look into the origins of the British monarchy. Who is really William the Conqueror, and what does he do in 1066? Well, who he is, as he puts it, a French bastard, an armed banditti who comes over and subdues the Anglo-Saxon people against their will. Possibly one of the first great moments of Western European colonization, in which the French Normans subject the Anglo-Saxons to their arbitrary and their hereditary political will, and they turn military occupation into political obligation. That, for Paine, is not politics. That is not government. That is conquest, pure and simple, even if it becomes a sort of endo-colonization in which the acts of military dictatorship with the acts of political coercion are done on one's own subjects, on one's own people. When Paine was born in Thetford, England in 1737, he lived in a place in town where you could see where the hangman would come every year and mete out the local justice. At the time of his birth, there were roughly 150 crimes in England for which you could be executed. One, I guess, was murder. That leaves 149 other things of which they thought it was good enough that you should be killed for. Paine wonders out loud in virtually every political text, and specifically he talks about this in Rights of Man Part 1 and 2. Why the use of violence? Why is this system of hereditary politics so violent? What is the use of this violence for? The use of the violence, he says, he comes to the conclusion, is to wield power unjustly. Because if power was wielded justly, if people were held accountable, if the true meritocracy was allowed to exist, and there could then be cooperation between people in an open way, you wouldn't need to oppress people. Why did the Normans need to oppress the Angles and the Saxons? Well, because they weren't necessarily so psyched about giving up their farmland, to be counted in the Doomsday Book, right, in 1088. All that stuff that they counted wasn't the Normans, 20 years earlier. And so you had to institute a military government to coerce tribute, i.e. taxation, out of people. Oh, there's a teabagger thing. Taxes. What are we using our taxes for? Anything in the right wing that smacks of taxes, they will latch onto, find an 18th century slogan, and talk about how taxes are bad. They miss the point, for example, that in agrarian justice, Paine says taxes should be levied on all personal and private property and real estate to create a general welfare fund for Social Security. And starting, I heard through the door someone mentioning that he was into redistributing property. I wouldn't call it redistributing property as simply taxing it properly. And that he believed, and he says quite clearly, that private property, that the distinctions of monarchy, that the distinctions of property are not those of God or nature, but those of society, therefore arbitrary, therefore subject to the will of the people to be done properly. And what Paine says again and again is that any time people aren't given their fair due, and the fair due is really simple. It's the right to think as you please, it's the right to live as you please, and it's the right to take part in your own self-governance. These three basic principles were so dangerous to the concepts of hereditary monarchy because remember, while we take for granted the slogan, all men are created equal and most Americans know that there are these phrases from the revolutionary period, that time and souls of summer soldiers. But they're not sure if the guy who wrote These Are the Times of Time and Souls is the same guy on which dollar bill, or which key tied to which thing, or did he cross the Delaware or the Schuylkill, or it's this vast amalgam of guys with, wigs. And, once in a while get thrown in with like a German, because they were Prussians there. But it's that type of distortion of both history and reality that Paine actually confronts again and again and again in his radical stance to debunk, for a very gentle term, the political and religious ideology of his time. This is what makes Paine such a man of the Enlightenment, such a figure from the Enlightenment, because the damn age gets the name from his book, The Age of Reason, right? And he's smart enough to borrow from Descartes to decide what reason really is. Reason is that one thing given by God to man that sets us apart from the animals, that allows us to discern an ass for a lion, or justice for injustice. And that if we have the capacity to use our reason honestly, if we are given and afforded the opportunity to pursue the reasonable conclusions that come from our observations of the world, we can come to no conclusions, he says, that are not but equitable, fair, tolerant, and so on and so forth. And you know, it's fascinating because the legacy of Paine, while being written out of history, of particularly bourgeois, here I get to sound all like late 1960s lefty academic British, sort of documentary. The lefty bourgeois history of the period. We forget that Paine wasn't even happy with Washington for a long time. We forget that Paine wasn't happy with the way things ultimately turned out in America, since we ended up with slavery, since we didn't end up with universal suffrage, since we didn't end up with the getting rid of the sort of indentured servitude. That Paine's figure in history is strange because, again, he's left out of that bourgeois history. But I'll tell you, there's somewhere where he has existed over the past 2 centuries. And that's in the political ideology of the left in the forms of working men's associations, in trade unions, in independent political civic organizations. Because I'll tell you, there's one thing that's fascinating about Paine. While there are some communitarian, slices to his ideology, he's not a communist. Can I tell you this? Okay. While there are ideas or echoes of the welfare state, he is not, he's not a 20th century sort of progressive. While there are even elements of the modern commons movement, which are all familiar with the idea of returning the land, and there's this just taxation she talks about, Paine's ideology still centers more on some basic, easily definable things. The concept of the rule of law applied humanely. And this is all Paine really expects, in some sense, that we should be able to pull off. And the fascinating thing about this is, if you can pull that off, what you see is Paine is an individual who believes in the necessity of a strong civic circle, a community of people who can take for themselves many of the responsibilities that are given to government in a pecuniary form. That the better and stronger a civic and social association between society and people, society is borne by our wants, government by our evils, the less and less and less we will need a coercive arm of government to keep us to behave in the right order. Now, to some this may smack of a very strange and very radical idea that the smaller, or the smaller the government sphere has to be, because the greater of responsibility taken by citizens and subjects themselves for their own lives, their own monitoring, blah, blah, blah. That's actually Locke and Hobbes, too. Right? They said, in essence, that in the state of nature, and Paine goes back to this often, but he has an interesting swing on the idea of the state of nature, that in the state of nature we are all inherently equal, and if we could behave according to our nature better, we wouldn't need government to lord over us and coerce us into respecting the rights of others. But, Freud, we get distracted by our passions, we get distracted by our own self-interest, and therefore can't necessarily live according to our best lights, right? And Paine uses this as a way to discuss the idea of political rights to a certain extent, but he doesn't rely on the idea of the state of nature as Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau do for the whole justification, because he says we have left the state of nature. It's fine as a philosophical principle, but it's not sufficient for a system of government. And much like Galileo, who he quotes, by the way, and talks about a lot in The Age of Reason, this truth is unpopular to the authorities or the powers that be, so they do their best to stamp it down. Right? This is the part of the Paineite history that is left out by the more academic, more bourgeois, more university training you to get to the cubicle to work for somebody else history, but remembered sort of on the Zinn Paineite working man's aspect of Paine's legacy. That it was one of struggle against, it was one of engagement in politics, it wasn't this sloganeering. Again, I go back to the right. Mouthing someone else's words is not the same as getting up and doing something about it. In a consumer society as we live, participation has been truncated to putting on a hat or a button or a slogan. The same thing, tragically, has happened with, I would argue, and I think Paine would say the same thing, our civil rights movements in this country. It's about the past and about we get Malcolm X on a stamp, so the struggle must be over. Martin Luther King has a day, therefore we must all be equal. There is a president who is part African American, therefore the age of race is over. Except for, the poverty rate, the reality of war, who we happen to be bombing on any given day. And again, for Paine, the issue wouldn't be, look at it how it seems from a sloganeering perspective. You need to read beyond the first 3 passages of any document by Paine and get into the meat and heart of the matter. Because what it means to be a summer soldier and a sunshine patriot is not to just show up at the rally and then drive home in your SUV. It's to live the life that expounds in a daily basis the idea of political equality or radicalism. Now this brings me to a part of the discussion about Paine that in some ways is most sexy. Who is this guy an archetype for? Well, he's an archetype for, I can't tell you how many Hollywood movie characters like the one played by James Woods in Salvador, right? The journalist, anarchist, revolutionary, romantic, live by this, coattails and fly into the maelstrom type thing. Paine sets this fascinating example because unlike the vast majority of philosophers, unlike the vast majority of even revolutionaries in the world, he is not from the property class, he is not from the aristocracy, a la someone like Abbé Sieyès in France or even George Washington in America. He's from the working class, whatever the 18th century version of the working class was, right? His father's an artisan. He has much more in common with Franklin and Rousseau than he does with Jefferson and Burke from an economic perspective. And as I said, at the time of his birth, there were 150 things for which you could be executed. And Paine knew that being born into the family he was born in, not just poor, not just artisan class, but also dissenter, because one of his parents was a Quaker. This puts you at a distinct disadvantage. And it created a concept of inherently unequal. Now again, in our society, we mouth this, all men are created equal stuff. But saying something is not the same as making it real, says Paine over and over and over. And unlike the consumer culture of today, where we in a sense are trained to believe the thing, because me and Kanta McDonald's, oh, therefore it must be the real thing. Paine wants us to look beyond the slogans, and even beyond his own slogans, because as I said, he wasn't a sloganeer. There is text, there is content behind the banner. There is a colon after the exclamation point. There is something that comes further to substantiate these ideas. And one of the fascinating things is that in modern politics, which has really, in a sense, burned down to the soundbite, right? The last political campaign, both candidates' slogan basically was change. I didn't know that was a political program. I'm not meaning to diss any advertising firm, but hope. I'm trying to remember what the crazy quote I heard about hope was when I was in the hospital the other day. And I heard a lot of weird things about hope in the hospital, I gotta tell you. It just came out. But it was something like, hope is the crazy, lazy man's refuge, or something like that. And I can kind of see Paine saying that, because he didn't hope for change. He went out there and did something for change. And even though his origins, as I said, were not of the typical revolutionary class, he not only challenged the 18th century and contemporary ideas about politics by the ideas he espoused, but by his own life, by deciding not to remain quiet in the subaltern position he was in, but to go and take an active role in transforming the world around him. He pulls himself out of that 18th century social pigeonhole and places himself above and beyond and in a different category of being, in a sense. I'm trying to get too Hegelian here. But he's living in a different world than the 18th century wants to put people in. He's living in a different world of a political involvement than even contemporary American politics wants to see. Because again, I say, think of the last political campaign, hope, change, those are slogans. Political campaigns have boiled down to 30 or 60-second spots, right? With waving fields of grain, babies of varying ethnicities, handshakes, and maybe some pastry. Usually a candle of some kind, maybe in an old age home, or young child's party. Right? And this is meant to conjure up these inarticulate feelings about politics that Paine wants us to make articulate. That if you do not expressly point out that hereditary monarchy is as much a fraud as hereditary mathematician, or hereditary poet, or infallible pope, then you're never gonna get anywhere. This is why I said earlier he's a man of his moment, this idea of reason, pragmatism. And for him, politics is a pragmatic science. The purpose is to fix the ills that society created for itself through the very mechanism of reason and applied rights. Right? I mean, he is at the end of the scientific revolution when all of a sudden we've seen the universe as this vast mechanical clockwork. And if you drop something, shit, it falls, and we can explain at what rate and why. This is a monumental step forward when you used to think a heavy thing and a light thing fell at a different rate. Well, what he's going to do is the same thing that his predecessors had to do, is view government as a machine for something. The question is, what's the something you get out from what you put in? And Paine recognizes that great 80s slogan, garbage in, garbage out. All of you who remember have to program something will remember that. Nowadays it's all pre-programmed. You don't have to worry about what's in and what's out. It's done for you. But if the political system has garbage going in, all this crap about hereditary monarchy, all this wonderful respect for the church, which isn't worth the respect, all this idea of inequality, what you're going to get out at the end, of course, is the same garbage. And what's radical about Paine here is that it's a complete transformation of the purpose of the mechanism. It's not to perpetuate the power of those who are in power, which is what the idea of government has been, as he points out, since the time of the pharaohs. Right? As soon as you have organized property, he writes about, as soon as you get organized property, you get organized government, you get organized religion, and the three work in concert to make sure that those who don't have it already don't get it ever. And that fundamental truth about the nature of politics is what makes him not liberal. Is he doesn't take for granted the 10,000-year-old history of agrarian society, of hierarchical property ownership leading to disproportionate political representation. He says quite clearly in Agrarian Justice, and again, challenging a fundamental assumption of politics in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, that if you are excluded from the economic world, you are somehow enfranchised in the political world. This is not a Marxist revolutionary call to working class revolution. This is his statement of, if you want to pretend to be a representative democracy, you have to let people represent themselves. And if they're economically excluded, they cannot fully represent themselves. Oh, and by the way, they need a public education too. Oops, Glenn Beck, sorry. Right? I mean, remember, here's the thing. It's not hard to go out there and find some right-winger spouting Paine. And it's not hard to find a left-winger telling you how they're wrong. Okay? I just am not sure where the disconnect is. And that's the part that really confuses me. Is the appropriation just cynical? I mean, just like Glenn Beck, probably. I mean, the guy has said repeatedly he's a clown, he's an entertainer, he's not a politician. Fine, he's an entertainer, so is Mickey Mouse. But we don't take Mickey Mouse as political ideology either, or at least we shouldn't, right? Judging from that 80 to 88 thing, you never know what's going on there. But, hang on. But for Paine, the idea is to turn politics into something that has real-world pragmatic effect. If you break from England, you're going to radically alter the relationship of not only us to them, but us to the world and us to each other. That's a substantive change with a different result, right? A crazy person does the same thing over and over and expects the same result. Well, Paine is in essence saying this to the political classes of his time. Unless you dismantle the political hereditary monarchy and all of its trappings in France, you can never have the origin of a new state. You can never break free from the tyranny of violence. You can never break free from the tyranny of inequality unless we do make a break from the past. That's what makes this radical. And what's fascinating about the right appropriation of this is that consistently their idea of revolution, or their idea of using Paine, is to not break with the present and the past, it's to return to a past. It's like the Newt Gingrich version of the 1950s, where everything was great for an upper white, middle class you know, white-collar worker who happened to somehow be involved with business in Central America, you know, plastics are booming, right? But not the reality of what politics in America was in the 1950s with the Atom Scare and the civil rights struggle. Remember, again, this goes to the reality of what does it mean to talk about civil rights and civil rights struggles today. We can put Malcolm and we can put MLK on a stamp, and we can honor them for their activity. But what we must do at the same time is acknowledge what it was they were fighting against, right? The injustice wasn't coming from somewhere else. The gagging and sedition acts weren't written by revolutionaries. The Patriot Act didn't come from Al-Qaeda. Those threats came from our own government, which against we must be vigilant. And again, for Paine, vigilant isn't the same as sloganeering. It's getting up and being involved, and if you excuse me, putting your shit on the line, as he did by spending 10 months in prison in France for standing up for the very basic principle that it's inhuman to execute anybody. It gives a bad example. It makes the state morally culpable. It doesn't recognize the reality of the situation, because as he points out somewhere, be careful what you do to your enemies, because someday they may be... He stands up for not executing the King of France for one basic reason. He's a person. He is victimized in the same way by this system as the lowliest peasant. Send him to America and re-educate the cat. And for this, he gets 10 months in prison, waiting to be executed. We all know the story, right? How he misses execution? No, we don't. We'll tell it for them out there. He's sitting in prison for 10 months. And his guards know who he is, and his fellow prisoners know who he is. He's just barely completed right in the age of reason, because he figures this is it. Tom Paine's last paean to the world will be a smack against the church and the Pope and the aristocracy, and a smiting for the justice of deism and right. But I'm on my way out, man. So he's in there, and he's ill, and they got the door open. On the night before they execute you, they come by and they mark the door for you, so they know who to gather in the morning. So they come by and they mark his door. And in the morning, they come by to collect people, and the door is closed. And there's no mark on the outside. It doesn't get any closer. You don't put it on the line any more than that. This wasn't, oh, I gotta, you know, whatever, my internet thing is down. I gotta wait for the guy. I can't make it to the rally, sorry. This was being there and doing it, right? And the thing about Paine, for me, is that the appropriate honor, appropriation, manifestation is not the simple, again, mouthing of slogans, but the getting out and doing. And the getting out and speaking power, truth to power. Because to truly, you know, live in Paine, you got to kind of live like Paine. And I guess I should be selling little bracelets with the initials, what would Tom Paine do? But we couldn't make them in China. They shouldn't be made of plastic. And all proceeds should go to the cause, like all of his works. Because again, putting it out there means putting it on the line. And all of his stuff, and all of his ideas. And again, this is why I didn't bother going into great detail. People know Paine. So what we're talking about here is the context in which he lived, and the context in which he can be viewed now, and what we can take from him. And I think at the end of the story, what we take from him is an extraordinary individual who had, for whatever set of reasons, either his upbringing, his education, just his personality, lived a life so exemplary and so different that 200 years after his death, groups of people come together like they did after his death every year in the 19th century, not just to celebrate his works, but to talk about what his works can mean and what we can do with them today. So the best thing, I guess, you know, in finishing a talk about Paine is to tell us to go out there and be like Paine. And, you know, that even is something he's very famous for, too, by the way, which is actually a form of political engagement. And that's sitting there and talking to somebody about politics. Even if we simply get engaged in political debate ourselves and learn to educate ourselves as he would have as a member of the White Hart Club in Lewes, as he would as a member of the London Corresponding Society, right? To go out and put your politics in the public sphere, part of the civic sphere, to draw down the power and authority of the state, and to clearly state your participation in that sphere of power. To regulate and run your own life. Because for Paine, that's what it was about, time and time and time again. It's the idea of rule of law applied humanely, with holding those in power responsible for their decisions. That's the legacy I give you for Paine in the 21st century. Thank you very much. We got some time for questions, yes, sir?
There's a number of things. One thing, the idea
I can't promise I can get all already.
The idea of the rule of law applied humanely, it is not politics. Politics is getting what I want and preventing you from getting what you want. If it interferes with what I want.
That's, if I might just interject, that's one version of politics. I mean, that's a Machiavellian version.
Not birds.
I think, well, we're not birds, sir, with all due respect. I think Paine would argue that it could be done with reason, and therefore, if done with reason, bereft of passion, and if therefore bereft of passion, one can overlook one's self-interest.
You know, I found that it's a lot easier for me now as a pensioned geezer to be in politics than it was before. I mean, you used the phrase about a timorous, untenured person. You know, Paine had the balls to just shoot up his mouth, but it got him in trouble. It got him in trouble in Paris.
Sure. Again, I wouldn't necessarily count as shooting off one's mouth, because I think Rush Limbaugh shoots off his mouth. I don't think Thomas Paine did. I think he challenged basic assumptions about social standards and politics and policy. I don't necessarily think. I think that would what we would call vibrant critique.
But
and yes, vibrant critique puts you at risk. Shit, yeah. Right? I mean, speaking against any status quo puts you at risk. I mean, i.e. Socrates, right? I mean, even Moses had to leave Egypt after he killed the other Israelites, right? I mean, he was a prince. So, the powers that be never want any questioning of who they are and what they are. I mean, you saw the cops there at the G20. Right? I thought I was watching Terry Gilliam's film Brazil when I saw the thought police down there in Pittsburgh during the G20. And in Copenhagen, the Danes, Jesus. But what are you doing? You question the powers that be, they will come down on you. And Paine, for whatever reason, as you point out, had balls and was willing to do it. Amen to those who do, because if they didn't, God knows what we'd still be. I mean, the first guy who went like, fire, and everyone said, oh, careful that guy, he's got this weird fire thing going on. You know, we never had fire before. My grandfather did just fine without fire. There's liberal fire media supporters.
But you can't encourage people to do that, because
why?
There are simple people that will do that.
Tommy, well, listen. Intemperance like elbows, you know, everybody's got them. I think for Paine, it's not just encouraging people to scream, it's encouraging people to think and then get involved. Yeah. And, you know, he didn't use exclamation points. Glenn Beck does!
He does use caps,
but you use caps because, you know, you're limited in graphic font. They didn't have apples yet. So, you know, graphics were limited to what size fonts you used. But, you know, but Paine and Limbaugh shout. I think Paine attempts to reason and to debate. You know, again. But it gets you in trouble. Let's let
the third thing, the last
thing. Sure, last thing.
You referred to the reenactors,
I was actually, in this case, be careful, referring to the reenactors as they show up at tea-bagging protests, not necessarily historical reenactors in general.
Oh, I think those people are just as crazy.
Whatever,
you know, in this country, we are taught history as myth. And because the American people are so uneducated, UNICEF ranked us 19th out of 23. I know people who are reenactors, Civil War reenactors, Revolutionary War reenactors, Ren Fay people who are dressed up like, I don't know what they dressed up like. And none of them understand the history of that period. None of them understand the filth of the Renaissance. Nobody understands the poverty of the American War of Independence.
I'll give you a perfect example. People who like to go and at this time of year celebrated Dickensian Christmas. friend of mine goes out to visit his relatives in San Francisco, and they set up a giant 19th century section of London inside a mall in which they actually have street urchins try and steal your wallet. It's like, let's recreate frickin' Dachau next. I agree with you, I agree with you. But you know what? In Elizabethan England, when they put on, when Shakespeare did Julius Caesar, they didn't put anybody in togas, by the way, right? They put them all in 17th century military outfit, because, hey, that's what a general wears. So historical ignorance has a long and storied history in the abuses, as Nietzsche would say, the uses and abuses of history. But I know, for an industrialized, advanced democracy, our education system is sorely lacking. If you want to be conspiratorial, it's because they don't want you to know. Who they is always a great question. I think it's the more problematic issue of Galbraith's common wisdom. If you simply say and put a label on it and you say that's the good guy, then it's easier to know which guy it is. Washington, the traitorous, blasphemous, slave-owning terrorist, right, is our founding father. I mean, we were founded by terrorists by the current definition of the Department of Defense. So where does that leave us? Yes, ma'am.
You left me hanging at the very end about he was in prison, they come around and put an X on the door. The next morning there's no X on his door.
And he gets out a couple weeks later when they finally change an American ambassador who doesn't despise him. See, because the American ambassador who was in France had a problem with Paine because back when he was the recording secretary for the Pennsylvania Senate, he was involved in the Silas Deane affair, where this guy was basically Halliburtoning the Constitutional Convention out of money, and he called him on it, and he was, of course, a respectable gentleman of means who would never steal any money from the Continental Congress, and of course he was. So this guy held a grudge, wouldn't acknowledge Paine's American citizenship. He was held in jail as a foreigner. That's the same reason he was kicked out of the Assembly. He and one other German were foreigners in the National Assembly. Paine was elected twice to the National Assembly, right? And then after he gets out of prison, well, we're really sorry, would you help us write our Constitution? He can't go back to America because the British have already got him under sentence of death for what he wrote, right? The Americans are having problems because he's published The Age of Reason. And so he ends up staying in France, being called on by, of all people, Napoleon, who Napoleon professes one night at a dinner that he sleeps with a copy of The Rights of Man under his pillow, and that a golden statue should be erected in every city, not in the world, but in the galaxy, to Tom Paine. And Paine stays involved, and by the way, the Louisiana Purchase is as much Tom Paine as it is Tom Jefferson, because he had the actual connection. So he gets out, and he comes back to wondrous support of the one friend he has left, the President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. He dies in relative obscurity. There's 6 people at his funeral. His servant's son named Tom, 2 freed slaves, and 2 other locals. And then someone steals his body like 10 years later, which in some ways may be appropriate. You know, a man without a country, a man without a gravesite.
But you still didn't answer about the prison time.
Yeah, the X, how did the X get
Oh, because at night, the door had been open, and so it was on the inside, and then they closed the door, and he's now on the outside, and you can't see.
Was that deliberate or an oversight?
No, it was an oversight.
I mean, the guards knew he was, but his door was open because he had been sick. So they were doing him this favor, right? Maybe he, in his delirium, was like, oh shit, yeah, you know, let's close this. But I just put it down to, like, you know, reality stranger than fiction. Yes, sir, with the hat in the back.
My name is Victor Madison from Allentown, Pennsylvania. Veterans for Peace, Chapter 152. We named it the Thomas Paine chapter last year. And by the way, we have the best website on Thomas Paine probably out there. It just so happens that yesterday, I filed a petition with the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania citing Thomas Paine's letter to the citizens of Pennsylvania about rewriting the Constitution. The section I want to call your attention to is where he says the granting of charters and monopolies was never imagined by our founders. And I think that's something that really applies today. But
well, I mean, again, I think that the thing we need to be careful about in any application of historical phraseology is it still appropriate to our present moment, right? Without knowing the specifics of your particular issue, my answer is that Paine, and I would go back to his use of this idea of the state of nature, right? He says the state of nature was good for a certain stage of understanding who we are and what politics should be, but things have changed. And therefore we need to have a different approach to a problem. And so what he might have written then might change now. There's no way to know. The thing I think is consistent with this particular phrase is the concern about entrenched power and the relationship between entrenched power and the government authorities who, quote, oversee it, and vice versa. So however we manifest this particular concern, right, whether we talk about monopolies and corporations or lobbying, or I think it's the primary issue is not the specifics of what law, but the intent through which the law serves. Does that follow as an answer to your question? So I think that it's appropriate to say this was a big issue 200 years ago. It should still be something we examine now. And perhaps I would argue the better way is the same solution still applicable, or, as from my Paineite orientation, is there something slightly over the horizon we should be looking at? I would say this about, bless you, I'd say this about Paine. You know, he saw beyond the horizon of the nation state to the necessity for transnational cooperation. He saw beyond, in fact, the idea of the government as the only means for social intercourse to the idea of, again, a self-regulating form of civic association. Had his ideas for an international peace treaty in the early 1800s been carried out, you would have had a small vision of the United Nations 150 some odd years before, or 40 some odd years before it had even been thought of by the folks during and after World War II. So, appropriate for the moment, certainly. Political question for all time, and the question isn't the specificity of a monopoly or corporation, because again, you know, that came at the end of the 19th century. And the irony is, the trust buster called, Teddy Roosevelt, called Paine a dirty little atheist. He didn't read them, right? He didn't read them again. So I think it's the orientation that we're best to take with Paine, rather than a canonical view of each word of text, because I have a distinct feeling that Paine would be pained by his words being seen as, you know, etched in stone, rather than in the living blood of the community. Yes, ma'am, with the purple hat.
Do you think there are any contemporary radicals of the stature today?
Noam Chomsky?
Yeah.
I mean, see, the problem now is it's hard to find an author and an activist in the same level of success.
And he was so consistently close to power.
Consistently close, but without having, and being in it. Yeah. I mean, some of the French, Jean Baudrillard, the French social theorist, he comes to mind. In American, Dennis Kucinich, from an ideological perspective, certainly, from a willingness to speak up, because somehow he keeps getting re-elected, I guess, you know, like the other 95% of his colleagues, which is something Paine would have a very, 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 very hard time with, right? You can't represent the people if you've not been amongst them for X number of years, and you've been on this almost a government sinecure.
But Norm Chomsky is like 80 years old now.
Yes, no. I posed a question recently to some colleagues at NYU about social philosophers writing actual social critique who are under the age of 50. And the only person we could come up with is 55, and he's Habermas's former student, and he's at the University of Frankfurt. That's one. Everybody else seems to be writing about people writing about. You
so
know,
how do you develop these kind of people now in this day when people are being, like, you know, squashed and taught not to be educated? The only way that you can educate yourself is self-education, because deliberately.
Well, I mean, look, I think we have the easy problem that institutions replicate themselves. If you only listen to what institutions tell you, you will only replicate what that institution does for you. Paine spoke out against the institution of government of the time. How do you train someone to see outside their own time, beyond the box?
You have to. I think
Paine would say the use of reason.
I think
Correct.
you have to teach people how to think, and that is deliberately.
I'm sorry, I missed the first half of that sentence. I'm sorry. What was
you have to teach people how to think.
Yeah, but to be fair, again, the concept of teaching someone to think is kind of like teaching someone to be a musician. I can learn the technical proficiency, but that doesn't make me John Coltrane.
Yeah,
I can put a ball through the thing, but I'm not going to be Michael Jordan.
I'm going to interject just a bit here. I actually think one of the issues that we have today is that, you know, we have progressives, but we don't have progressives with a populist voice. It seems like populism has actually been really more co-opted by the likes of, you know, like Coulter or Limbaugh or Beck or whatnot. And the left seems to be, you know, unwilling to use this language. And what's interesting about this, it actually dates back to the 1790s, because what you had is, you had William Pitt trying to get all these writers to write against Thomas Paine. And so they hired Hannah More and whatnot. And they were writing in this sort of popular style. And since then, it seems like that the conservatives have been trying to do that. That's why all these astroturfing.
Well, astroturfing goes way back to the same period of time with the king and country crowds who were paid off by the local authorities to go rally against whomever. But I think the problem, there's a twofold issue here. One is the tea baggers folks are often dismissed by the left for, frankly, I believe, classist reasons. Their rage is real. What they're pointing out as a problem is real. You may differ with what they think is the cause necessarily, that the president is from Mars or a Muslim or something, but there is gross inequality in the United States, and this is what they're screaming about. In the last year, there has been an equal division of wealth in terms of split of upward wealth transfer, as in all 8 years of the Reagan year, Reagan presidency. In the last 12 months, under the liberal Barack Obama, this division of wealth has been going. So here's the thing. It's not so much that the left needs to reacquaint itself with populism, or liberals need to reacquaint themselves with populism. I think, again, I go back to Galbraith here. It's like we are stuck in this idea where we've elected a liberal, so things are going to be fine. The question is the guy really liberal? Does the Democratic Party still represent the liberal or trade unions or the folks they used to represent, which got them to that stature of being liberal? And rage is left to people who seem totally disenfranchised because they've also been left behind in the culture wars. I mean, that's the weird part of it. Their political identity has come to the fore as a result of stoking fears about, Madonna and evolution. But it's manifesting itself in economic and political terms about the particular situation at the moment. So they've become galvanized by cultural issues. Their identity has been forged around culture issues, but now the rage is being directed at a particular moment of political and economics. Since the left sees itself in power with Barack Obama, they may be much less willing to offer a critique. Dean, just yesterday, is saying, I don't know that I can support this guy vigorously, given what he's done to the public option.
Well, the thing is this.
So maybe, maybe the left needs to get a little angrier again and understand that there is a critique on the right that needs to be recognized as valid. And that if anything, may open the opportunity for dialogue and cooperation. Because I'll tell you, from everything I've read from Paine, Paine would be looking for an opening to find common ground, to make common cause with almost anybody he could make common cause with, if they could agree on the parameters of moral, rational action. And if not, that's a different problem. But you don't know till you get engaged.
But didn't you really hit it before in your earlier, where you were saying that the critique matters more than the issue, right? And the style of the critique.
In this instance, I'm referring to slightly different things. I think the critique of the Tea Party and right-wing protests has left out the legitimacy.
No. What I'm saying is, what I'm saying is that I think you hit it on because you were talking about staying to a certain set of values and bringing that in. And I think the right, frankly, to an extent, does much better at it than the left, because they have separated out in many ways from a lot of society. And so they stay very, very firm on their critique. And the fact is, if you go to a Tea Party rally,
it's pretty homogenous.
Well, it's very homogenous, but the interesting thing about it is, so what are they talking about? They don't like bailing out big banks. They don't like an oppressive government. I mean, we're starting to see a pattern here. This doesn't sound, it's not that bad a message, it's just wrapped into.
Well, again, and I think for Paine, part of the issue is where they place blame. Right. As part of the issue, because
they place it on the other.
Right, and not just the other, but on a mistaken concept of what may actually be going on. right? To delegitimize someone, you say they're not a citizen, right? To delegitimize the state of Israel, you say there was no Holocaust. So, in other words, you fabricate a history to give yourself a political platform and orientation now. This is where I think the teabag thing gets very confusing, because it's an inaccurate appropriation of what the Founding Fathers stood for in the context of their moment. It's a legitimate critique of a particular set of economic and political conditions, and then it's wrapped in all this other weird, as seen from the outside of the circle, the weird rhetoric. I am unclear as to how the participants envision the reception of their own projection. Are you following me?
Oh, yeah.
So that to me is something I don't know, I can't even begin to imagine. So I just kind of leave it to time. And look, I leave it to what Paine says, time makes more converts than reason. So we've got to see how this plays itself out.
Well, you know, there is actually one thing I was going to say about the, Obama's Muslim and whatnot. Actually, Paine in some ways was not above using that in common sense either, because he talks about these dangers posed by the Indians and whatnot, even though he was sympathetic
Sure,
to
and he quotes the Bible, for God's sake.
Yes, yes.
I think there's maybe two answers. Great rhetorician and perhaps subject to intellectual evolution.
But this is another thing, too. I think that what's going on is that Paine was writing really for the first time to the common people. And what's happening today on the left, I think, is that many of them are really writing to more, I think at least a college-educated audience. Whereas Rush and whatnot, they are writing basically to anyone. And I think the closest person we have on the left to Paine, perhaps in terms of styles, may be Michael Moore, but it's different because he's a filmmaker. But I think it's the closest because most.
Well, I certainly think that Moore speaks. Look, let's talk about language in a broader sense than words, right? So the language is a means of communication in a given historical context. Moore uses the language of film, the language of the TV news broadcast, the language of the internet as a presentational model to get to his particular audience. And I think you're exactly right if you look from a journalistic standpoint of communicating information and a political intent. Michael Moore may come the closest, and by the way, shares a class heritage with Paine that may make you particularly susceptible to seeing the inequalities of the world and less able to gloss over them. Even less able than Alexander Hamilton, who comes from a disadvantaged background, but is a son of a bitch social climber who wants to make his way up into the elite, who parodies and parrots, therefore, the ideas and ideology of the elite. Well, and again, look at Limbaugh and Reagan. Reagan comes from a middling class background, is a lefty union organizer type until that fateful year, 1957, when he gets a $150,000 contract to be the spokesman for GE. And I can tell you, $150,000 in 1957 is about $2.7 million minimum today. So if you know which side your bread is buttered on, you will make sure you don't drop that butter side down. Francis.
My question is, first off, I hope that you're feeling better.
Thank you.
My question is, in today's world where there is so much noise,
yes,
how do you have your voice heard when you dissent so that it really is heard and not grabbed as a sound bite or used by this group or that group so that someone reads the content, understands the substance?
Not to be evasive, I think the first thing we need in that particular question is to establish who the you is at any given moment. Is it you an individual? Is it you a member of a group? Is it you a member of an ideological cadre? Whatever. I think the easiest answer, the most straightforward answer, is your physical presence somewhere. In the English tradition, there is a very long history of the public protest. Of this is the guy we can tar and feather, or even go outside his house with the pots and pans. And from the 15th, really, to the 19th century, that public protest was made visible by your presence on the scene. This turns itself into the 19th century idea of what we see that is manifest now in, say, the anti-war rallies before the Iraq War. The problem is twofold, though. One can make one's voice heard, and it can be completely ignored by the powers that be, right? And the question then becomes really not how do you make your voice heard, but what do you do when your voice is being articulated, when it's even coming on the damn news, and yet not heard, ignored. This is where the Tea Party folks like to borrow the Paine rhetoric that's particularly fiery and confrontational because, God damn it, like Howard Beale, they're fed up, they're mad as hell, they're not going to take it anymore, and in the United States you resolve conflicts through threats of violence. So, and Paine again though, Paine saw the necessity of judicious applications of violence in the form of self-defense when necessary. This has been turned by people who feel excluded, who feel frustrated, into a general call for mayhem and destruction. That's where it gets really weird and dangerous. I don't have a particular answer to the problem of democratic politics in the 21st century, but I think the showing up part is, as Woody Allen says, 90% of the genius. What we have been acculturated to, arguably in the 21st century, is a passive form of political involvement in which you are a consumer, which literally you take in and put on rather than go out and do as a form of political expression. Which brings me back to what I said at the end of this. What do we take from Paine? We take that you're not a passive observer. We shouldn't be passive observers. We should be citizens and not subjects, for whatever that means. The idea of how you can be manifesting yourself is left open very broadly. What does Thoreau say in Civil Disobedience? It is not my duty of any course to right all the wrongs in the world. I'm paraphrasing slightly. But it is, I have the right to go about my business as I see fit. But it is my duty to see that I don't do it standing on the other shoulders of a man. So that you could go back to that 60s slogan, the political is personal, the personal is political. So for Paine, you live the life of political ideology and social awareness that you mouth, right? If you're in a consumer society, and if you can see the ills of consumerism, not just on what it does to the planet, what it does to our health, what it does to all the shit in our garage, right, our use of space, but what it's done to political discourse. You can attempt to remove yourself from whichever part of that dialogue is becoming debilitating to getting at the truth, if that's any kind of answer. So again, I think the answer from a Paineite perspective is reasonable, insightful, rational, persistent, fearless involvement. That, Paine was a union organizer. Like, that's his first gig in terms of like stepping out into the world. And I can tell you from personal experience what that usually gets you is fired. Okay. But if we let, and I have gone through zero compared to the real strugglers in the world of politics and unions. But if we are afraid of consequences, there can never be any change. I hate to sound like some sort of Spartan ant here, but if you don't go boldly forward, no one goes forward at all. And unfortunately, there's going to be casualties. And if, like Paine, we are willing to make ourselves casualties for the cause, that changes the cause. The weird thing about the G20, let's just talk about this for 1 second. The use of non-lethal weapons is arguably the greatest step towards a full-on totalitarian control of people that we've ever seen. Because for the first time, you can physically not move yourself towards the barricade when that sound weapon or when that heat weapon is turned on. You can heedlessly throw yourselves into a hail of bullets, knowing perhaps it'll only hit the guy next to you. But if you are being physically restrained from moving forward because of auditory or heat sensation, that has put the kibosh on the type of political activity we have typically associated with revolutionary politics. Not that I am invoking or endorsing in any way violent revolution as a means to transformation. Take Thoreau and Gandhi and Paine. If you're going to make a real revolutionary change, you break from the past, which means perhaps the form of political transformation you're talking about does not rely on the use of violence as a means of coercion. Paine says again and again and again and again, the best way is to talk, is to reason, is to think it out. If you have to resort to something for self-defense, so be it. But that's not the way you make a point. right? He condemns the William the Conqueror for doing that. He condemns the Israelites in the Old Testament for going in and slaughtering everybody. And so I can only conclude from that, from Paine, the first several steps have to be a reasonable, honest attempt at discourse. If that discourse is denied, as it was by the king, by the parliament, by Edmund Burke, that brings you to a different situation. The teabagger folks and the anarchists, by the way, have gotten to points where we know they're out there. We know they're actually social tropes at this point. The kid from New School in black is an anarchist. The overweight housewife with the funny hat is a Tea Party protester. They're so well known that they've almost become tropes, right? But they don't see themselves having influence, and so we break the Starbucks windows or we threaten the president. But they can only do that because how does authority speak to them? It speaks to them, as Paine says, they learn their violence from the institutions that put their head on a pike in the first place. If the king, Foucault, right, discipline and punish, the state knows which part of your body corresponds to which particular political crime. And so they use your body as a physical advertisement for punishment for violating political taboos. So revolutionaries are going to learn the same language of physical, dismemberment to make a political point. And what Paine says when he stands up for the king not being executed is that we need to make a break from that form of political action as a means to change if we're going to change for real. Yes, sir, a little more?
Yes.
Francis, you cut us when we're ready to go.
We just have time for two more
Two,
questions.
sure.
Okay, yes. One thing confused me from what you said earlier. All it was articulate. Just one thing confused me. You related, I think, 3 times Paine to communism. And in each time you said he was not a communist. So
correct.
It's what he's not. But communism came so much later.
Correct. That's why I think he's not a communist. I'm not trying to be flippant, but very often when anyone talks about, different distributions of wealth, they're labeled a socialist, a communist. So from my perspective, this is simply a rhetorical technique to make sure we don't mistake one thing for another. There's another reason he's not a communist. He lived before the industrial age, for one.
He lived before communism.
Yes. I mean, there was, again, this is why I said there are communitarian strains, right? And there were communitarian ideas that were current at the time of his writing and his death. The Owenites, right? The Saint-Simonists were all early 19th century political philosophers who had a vaguely, communitarian idea that can be related back through people like More, frankly, to visions of communitarian Christianity, which are again articulated later by people like Bellamy, right, in the Christian socialism of late 19th century America.
That's fair enough. If you had said he's not communitarian.
But he is vaguely communitarian. See, that's what I mean. I did say that, yeah. I think what I said there are strains of communitarianism, but without being a communist. Okay. Yes, ma'am, in the back with the sunglasses.
When one is fighting the war for peace, how do they handle others misreporting them? How do you handle that situation? Of being mislabeled or misreported?
Oh, well, I guess there's one that springs to mind. It's kind of what Oscar Wilde said. Don't worry about when they say bad things about you, just worry when they're not talking about you. And the other thing that Paine would have done is, I don't care. I mean, keep going. It's not, they misreport who I am. They do that to slant my message. I'm going to keep giving my same message over and over again. And if anyone has been subject to misinformation and slander and disinformation about his career and his ideas, Thomas Paine fits that bill. And I think in some ways, I would like to imagine one of my heroes being big enough to deal with it. But I can imagine there were some days when it was worse and some days when it was better. And maybe all the more infuriating because he knew that everything he'd done was done in good conscience for the best of intentions. And to be slandered and maligned for your honest hard work is possibly the most difficult thing ever. But he would probably say that, you keep doing what you're doing and let the record be the thing that you end up debating. Don't bother trying to correct the record. If you examine it and see what I've actually done, that's how the best judgment will be made. And by the way, that's how he says to do with the church and with monarchy and with the revolution. Burke complains what the revolution does, and he says, yes, but Mr. Burke hasn't paid attention to what the revolution actually did. He complains and says how great the monarchy was, but ignores what the monarchy did. The church was the greatest tool for coercion, blah, blah, blah. So again, in each instance, you know, public enemy, man. Don't believe the hype. Get to the actual cause, get to the actual thing itself. And I would think he would mostly take that perspective from something having to do with his own self and how he's being characterized. If someone wants to call him a filthy little atheist, that's their problem. I'm not. Next is where I think he would situate himself.
Well, I feel everyone is subject to opinion. However, I guess actions speak. So it's just continuing to act for a greater cause.
That's what I believe. If you know, if we were to channel Paine as 21st century Dr. Phil guest, I think he would say, you know, you keep on keeping on and keep on doing what you're doing, and that will be the way in which ye shall be judged. That's what I would say.
Just one more
Just
question.
something very quick, because you were saying something about discourse. This seems like an age when they try to stifle discourse, and any intelligentsia or anything like that is bad. It's a negative thing, and if you want change, it's negative. You're fighting such people.
Monolithic structures? Yes, that's called society. I mean, how much worse is GE and NBC than the Pharaoh and the temple god, temple priest of Ra?
It's easier now.
I mean, you know, I think as part of our nature, we like to think we've got it the worst or the best ever. You know, you and I can go out in the corner of 14th and 6th and scream our bloody little heads off. And, you know, whether it has a result or not is an interesting question. We may feel a lot better. It may not change the moment of the politics, but you know, if we lived in Morocco, we wouldn't have either possibility. So, you know, these monolithic structures, they've always existed as long as there's been organized society. The only time there's been any, you know, any chink in the armor, any movement forward is when people have stood up and taken those risks. So we need to, Paine would say, consistently, repeatedly, and honestly go out there and deliver your message.
Well, they did that in the 60s, the students marching.
Sort of. But no offense, remember, it got co-opted by this weird counterculture machine of the entertainment industrial complex, right? And so now the monkeys are like, you know, monkey songs are played to conjure up, like, you know, the age of Vietnam. And like, oh man, right? I mean, you know, Mike Nesmith's really good. I like Repo Man, but it's not meant to be a critique of Western military society. So the problem may be more the reality of mass culture than necessarily, I'm being a little flippant when I say, oh, that's society. I think, in fact, what you particularly are pointing about is the reality of mass communicative culture. I mean, this is a Habermas question, transformation of the public sphere. Once you move into a mass communicated public sphere whose primary goal is commerce and misdirection, because if Coke is the real thing, man, we're in trouble, right? So, in fact, as Chomsky points out, it's meant to distract you, it's meant to mislead you, it's meant to bring you to a point. So that perhaps the political engagement we are talking about needs to be taken part outside of the type of commercial discourse through which political speak has been encapsulated. This is why, perhaps, the internet offers some new ground for political organizing. Maybe. It's way, way, way too young. Way too young. I just don't know. I'll tell you the thing that scares me the most, and then we can close on this one, about political discourse in the 21st century, is we are moving, as a culture, we are moving away from communicating through words. We are going back to some almost pre-literate communication with images through the TV, through visual mediums, through video games. It's much more like walking into a medieval cathedral or a pharaonic temple than it is an 18th century political pamphlet. When the political campaign is the swaying, you know, the grain, the baby, the toy, and the cake, that can be made to mean anything. So our political discourse may need to move into a new realm and to pull ourselves out of this commercialized public sphere and back into a place where discourse is about things rather than substitutes, slogans, brands for the thing. Thank you.